everybody, and welcome to Maestro BPM's home studio. Today I'm just going to take you through some of the setup of my studio here, starting with the overview here, a bit of a schematic diagram showing an overview of how everything's connected. We'll be using this schematic diagram just highlighting each of the components as we show them to you. Just highlight that USB and audio are shown as different connection types there, with audio connections shown as a thin solid line with an arrow, generally showing the direction of the audio output, and then the thicker dashed line which signifies the USB connections. The first item we're going to look at is the Mac Studio. So this is a relatively new piece of equipment for me, and this forms the central part of my studio. I'm using Logic Pro primarily for my music production, with a ton of plugins and a few other little bit of peripheral bits of software, and it's right here on the machine. This Mac Studio is connected into the studio primarily by USB connections, USB A and USB-C connections, all those dotted lines that you can see there, and you can see the Mac Studio is right in the middle of the studio workflow. On the left are just controllers, interfaces to the Mac Studio, primarily controllers, I beg your pardon, and on the right hand side we can see USB connections into audio interfaces, which then expand out into the analog realm of my recording studio. I do also have a series of keyboard controllers and things like that, which I'm not going to run through today. The first thing we're going to look at today is the UC1 controller. First thing connected to the Mac Studio, that is. A completely USB interface, which is a dedicated plug-in controller for the solid-state Logic plugins, the native channel strip and native bus compressor. Both emulations of some classic old SSL desks. Really great little piece of equipment, and I use the channel strip on just about everything that I record. And similarly, I would use the bus compressor on most of the tracks I record as part of the mastering chain. The next controller connected to the Mac Studio is the Loupedeck CT. Really has been designed for use with video and photo editing software programs, but it does have some profile built in, or profile that you can download for Logic, and I've been using this extensively. Really quick, easy access to controls. I do have a XSKN keyboard cover, silicon sort of easy touch keyboard cover for my keyboard, which does have all of the Logic keyboard shortcuts printed on it, which is great. But then the Loupedeck I just find is a nice little handy bit of controller. It's got a few infinite rotary encoders, which you can use for various zooms and scrubbing kind of functions. And I often use this in conjunction with a couple of the other controllers that I do have. The first one of those being the Presonus Faderport 16. So 16 channel flying fader, motorized fader mixing interface for Logic. It's got a bunch of pretty simple channel controls, so mute, select, record arm, etc. It's also got transport controls built into it, and a few other sort of shortcuts, etc. Using this mostly for the sort of tactile fader interface that it provides. Again, this is a USB connection, absolutely no audio running through this, and integrated straight into Mac for mix control. Now we step outside of the realms of the purely digital and the USB controllers, and first step into the analog realm, and here I have the desktop rack. So the desktop rack is just populated with a little bit of analog outboard gear, as well as a patch bay that I can use to patch in and out of Logic. But the first step before we even get into the desktop rack, and you notice this isn't actually mounted into the rack itself, is the Arturia AudioFuse Studio. Really great little interface. I/O's got at least 4 in audio analog inputs and outputs, might even be a little bit more than that, I can't remember. Also use this for my headphone monitoring. Pretty flexible little unit and great for me to quickly just plug in things on the front interface panel there, and obviously can patch in over at the rack, the desktop rack as well. Here you can see it in the schematic diagram, and just note that there is that one USB connection into it, and then there's multiple points of audio in and out. I do also have a separate ADAT connection between the AudioFuse H Pre in the sidecar rack and the AudioFuse Studio. 2 connections actually, so that I can get 8 channels of 96K audio between the two. The key piece of equipment to help me get out of the interface and then into the rest of the outboard gear is the patch bay you can see at the bottom of the outboard rack. Every single input and output of the outboard equipment as then appears on the patch bay on the left hand side, and then there's also some patching for into the AudioFuse Studio, so I can route audio out of the AudioFuse Studio, say from Logic, into the patch bay, connect it across into one of the items of equipment in one of the items of outboard equipment, and then patch it back into Logic. First item of outboard equipment that we're looking at here is the Meek Studio Channel VC1Q. Single channel of audio and really nice little channel strip. Some pretty basic EQ on it, built-in compressor as well. I haven't given this a lot of use, probably a little bit underused actually. By the time we get to the end of this video, you're probably going to think that I'm like sponsored by TL Audio. I do have a little bit of TL Audio kit in my studio. First item we're looking at the bottom of this image here is the C1 compressor, so dual channel compressor. It's got a valve stage in it, so you can get a bit of nice warm valve compression saturation in your mix using that little unit there. Similarly then, the second item of TL Audio equipment in the desktop rack is the TL Audio EQ2. That's 2 channels of parametric EQ, each one having, let's see, we've got high and low filters. We've also got 1, 2, 3, 4 stages of full parametric EQ. Again, running through a valve stage, so it does get a little bit of that valve warmth. Next item of equipment at the bottom of the desktop rack is the TC Electronics M3000 effects processor, dual channel effects processor. A fair bit of flexibility in how you set up the effects engines within this. You can have them in parallel or in series, or run completely independently. I'll run through this in a separate video at some stage. Quite a powerful yet relatively cheap little piece of equipment. Probably not something that you would necessarily need to have, especially if you've got Logic. Most of the plugins built into Logic probably far superior to what the TC M3000 can do. However, it's always nice just to have something tactile to play with here on the desktop. I bought this unit at a reasonable price, about $800 Australian, and very quickly the power supply failed in it. However, it seems that that's a common problem for these units, so I was able to pick one up, replacement one, shipped out from Europe for about $150, and it was actually a pretty simple repair in the end. Next we're looking at the sidecar rack. Now, I might be misappropriating the word sidecar, but this is a completely separate rack into which I've got built a number of different pieces of equipment, mixer, another interface, another Arturia interface, and the Otari tape machine. As you can see, the connection between the sidecar rack and the Mac again is a USB connection to the Arturia interface, and then which is the Arturia AudioFuse 8 Pre, which has then got 8 inputs and outputs. Not the same quality of I/O that you get on the AudioFuse Studio. It doesn't have quite the same sample rates available on it, but then it is connected via a patch bay. Now, the way I'm showing the patch bay here is not quite right. The inputs and outputs of the TL Audio M3 mixer and the Otari MX-5050 basically direct into the patch bay in a half normal configuration, so that then if I don't have the patch cords plugged in, as you can see here on the patch bay picture, if they're not plugged in, then it cascades from the output, the output of the Arturia interface, into the mixer, then the direct out of each channel of the mixer then goes to the inputs of the tape machine, and then the outputs of the tape machine go back into the AudioFuse 8 Pre. So that diagram there of the patch bay is not exactly correct, but you get the idea, just to indicate how the audio sort of cascades from the mixer into the tape machine back into the interface. The idea here, the way I've got it set up, is that if I was to be doing, tracking 8 channels of microphone, it would go via the mixer into the tape machine. But similarly, if I had recorded something onto the tape machine, I could repatch that and send it back through the mixer before going back into the Logic, if that's something that I wanted to do. So first port of call really in the sidecar rack is the AudioFuse 8 Pre. Again, USB connection to the Mac Studio, but at the moment I'm actually using an ADAC connection between the AudioFuse 8 Pre and the AudioFuse Studio. I think I've got some power gremlins in my system at the moment, so I'm getting quite regular dropouts between the sidecar rack and Logic. Audio just seems to drop out randomly for short periods of time. When on USB, it was definitely dropping out quite regularly and for a few seconds at the time. Now I just seem to have regular bursts of noise, which is kind of annoying. The next item of equipment is the TL Audio Tubetracker M3 mixer. Really cool mixer, which I picked up for relatively cheap, about £1,000 in the UK earlier, about a year ago actually. Brought it home, fixed it up, had a few little minor issues, and have racked it up into the sidecar rack here, as you can see in the picture. A separate video on disassembling the M3 mixer, which is a bit of a pain in the behind to get open and to play around with. If you look at that video, you'll see how it's done. It's really not that hard once you had a look at that video. And in fact, tonight I am recording through channel 1 of the M3 mixer. I've got my microphone plugged directly into it. It's just helping give me a little bit of tube compression through this very sensitive microphone that I'm using. Then the final piece of the puzzle in the studio, kind of the centerpiece really for me, is not necessarily the Mac Studio, it's the Otari MX-5050 Mark III-8. This is an 8-channel, half-inch, reel-to-reel tape recorder. A little bit of a gem, Japanese-made, engineered and built, and quite common, I believe, to have been used in radio stations and television stations for archival of audio recordings, but also used in some music studios as well. At a particular note, the Otari MX-5050 Mark III-8 was used to record Bleach by Nirvana. I've got a couple of separate videos on the 8-track on my YouTube channel, and I reckon I'll probably post a bit more on the actual use of it. I've got a few videos of me taking the thing apart, but yeah, well, I think the next video might be me threading up some tape and playing around with that a little bit. Anyway, that's Maestro BPM Studio. I hope you enjoyed the video. Any questions, chuck them in the chat. Check you later.